RPGs and action games are like my bread and butter. So when the two genres come together, I gravitate towards that fusion like a fat kid gravitates toward his local bakery. Now while there are great action RPGs, and terrible ones, this game resides firmly nestled in the middle. It fervently flirts with both greatness and garbage, but neither of them asks for a second date. This game is very solid in its own right, but has some questionable design choices. It has ideas that could have been great, but fall short, and ideas that hamper the experience, but not enough to really hold it against it. Visuals in this game are just all over the place. Now this is an older game, so it isn't really fair to rag on it too much. But at the same time, there are some things that are really off. For the most part though, I have to say it's a really good looking game. Particularly, the FMV that you see when you start the game up looks absolutely fantastic. The only problem is that it's the only one in the game. I think they should have added at least one more when you beat the game, but alas, this was not meant to be, which is a shame because it looks really good. Particle effects are nice and flashy, and environments are pretty detailed. The character models, however, are, well, shit. This is especially true during cutscenes, where the animations look about as fluid as androids. Luckily, the main characters of the game fare better than most others, although the animations are still questionable at best. I have to say though, animations during combat are nice and smooth, and honestly, it's better to have smoother animations during combat than the cutscenes. I gotta say though, the music in this game is fucking outstanding. As per usual, Motoi Sakuraba, who normally does the music for other Tri-Ace games, has crafted the music in this soundtrack, and it's some of his best work, honestly. While it doesn't touch the haunting beauty of his Dark Souls soundtrack, this is still some of his best. As a fan of his music, this was certainly a treat. However, while the music was great, the voice acting and the lip syncing was less than stellar. Now, the main characters, such as Capel, Sigmund, Aya, and Edward, are actually voiced fairly well. Most other characters don't sound quite as good. However, the voice acting is never so bad that it ruins the experience. This game stars Capel, an awkward flute player who gets mistaken for a revolutionary going around liberating the lands. Capel gets caught up with this ragtag group of liberators and helps them break the chains that are dragging down the moon down to the planet. While the concept is actually pretty cool, the story as a whole is pretty standard. There are some rather interesting twists here and there, but overall the story is solid. The characters on the other hand are a bit more unbalanced. The four main characters of the game are actually really good, particularly Capel and Edward, as they go through a lot of development, which was done really well. However, the problem that this game has is that there's way too many characters. Now, there's a gameplay reason as to why there's so many. But in terms of story, rarely do any of the characters, other than the main four, get screen time. So it's really hard to care about any of them that aren't the main four. Although I have to say, the characters I hated the most were Rika and Rucha. Fuck these little kids. They should have not been in the game at all. They're just annoying and bleh. Otherwise, there's not much else to say here. Could have been better, but for what it is, it gets the job done. Now, I love me some action RPGs, so I was really drawn to this game's combat. This game also tried to do a few other things, and while it had some good ideas, not all of them meshed well. For example, there are multi-party battles, where you can have up to 3 groups, depending on which battle it is, of characters running around at the same time fighting enemies. While this may sound cool, it rarely actually plays into gameplay, and it just feels like a needless addition. The only times where I actually felt this was a worthwhile mechanic was during certain difficult boss fights. Those fights were admittedly pretty epic, however it really didn't justify the mechanic as a whole. There's also the flute that Capel uses. He can use it to find secrets and dispel magic. While that sounds cool as well, it's rarely used. Halfway through the game, I actually forgot that this mechanic even existed. I only remembered because the game forced me to do it at some point. Finally, there's the whole connect system. You can tell other characters to use specific attacks while connected to them, either because you want them to do it during a battle or to find treasure. It's a neat idea, but battles are too chaotic to even think about using them, so it really is just relegated to just treasure hunting. Just like the flute. I think if all of these ideas were tossed aside and more time was spent on making the combat better, I think this game would have been way better. But alas, such is not the case. Still, the core combat itself is actually pretty good. You run around and use combinations between the A and B buttons in order to use different kinds of attacks. As you level up, you learn different skills that you can assign to the A and B buttons, so when you hold down the button, you will use a different skill. Unfortunately, this sometimes leads to using the attacks when you don't want to, but normally isn't an issue. What's cool is if you keep using these skills, they will actually level up and grow more effective over time, which is something I really like. One last thing about these skills is that if you assign a skill to the B button, the skill will take up more MP but will actually do more damage as a result, and the opposite is true for the A button. It's a nice bit of strategy added to decide whether you want a skill on the A button or the B button. Now, an issue I have is that the game gives you a lot of skills, but I would have liked to have used more than just 2 at a time. Something else that bothered me about the combat was how easy you get knocked out of your attack animation. Even for skills, it's especially annoying because skills take up MP. Precious MP that you don't want wasted, and yet it happens whether you want it to or not. One last thing to complain about would be the parry system. Battles in this game are usually pretty chaotic, so the parry mechanic is completely useless. A block button would have been much better. Now, a feature that was added that I thought was actually really brilliant was how the Y button is used in combat. Whenever you're low on health, or if other characters are low on health, just press the Y button, and your characters with healing magic will automatically start casting those spells and attempt to heal the other character. If you don't have any characters like that, then they'll start using items, which is a really good idea. However, that leads me into another complaint. Your AI is usually pretty smart, but the problem is that they use items without your consent, even when you don't use the Y button. It's not that big a deal, especially towards the beginning of the game or the end of the game, because in the beginning battles are pretty easy and towards the end you have tons of cash. But in the middle of the game, when you're not really rich and the game's not that easy anymore, that's where it starts to become an issue. Still, complaints aside, the combat in this game is really a lot of fun. While it's not as deep as, say, Star Ocean 4's combat, it's still a lot of fun to run around hacking and slashing enemies. Infinite Undiscovery is a solid game for the most part, but there are a lot of areas in it that almost dip into both brilliance and inadequacy. While not the best in Trice's resume, it's by no means their worst either. Flaws I mentioned don't faze you, and you want to play a decent action RPG, go right ahead and put some money down for this game. It's not too lengthy though, it's only about 25 hours, but the game is really cheap. I picked my copy up for about $8, which is definitely a steal. Anyways, this has been Shintai, folks. Take care.